The lobby of Pinnacle Financial Group gleamed the way only money could make things gleam. Marble floors, brass fixtures, the quiet hum of ambition moving at 70 floors per minute. Brittany was mid-tour heels, clicking smile perfected when she saw him. Wrinkled t-shirt, gray sweatpants. Shoes so worn the sole had separated at the toe. He stood in the cafeteria line with the stillness of a man who hadn't slept, hollow eyes, unshaved jaw, a paper cup held loosely between calloused hands. She didn't hesitate, didn't whisper. "Oh my God." She turned to the Chicago delegation, voice bright and carrying. Did someone actually let a homeless man walk in here? The laughter spread fast and easy. He set the cup down, walked out. Behind him, not one security guard moved. None of them would look at each other. His name was on the building. Not in the way that names end up on buildings bought, donated, negotiated over lunch at some midtown steakhouse. Daniel Mercer had put his name on Pinnacle Financial Group, the same way a man puts a scar on his body through something that cost him over a long time, with no guarantee it would ever heal. Right, 18 years. That was how long it had taken to turn a shared office in a walk-up on the Lower East Side into 47 floors of steel and glass overlooking Manhattan. He'd slept on the office couch for the first 2 of those years, eaten from the deli downstairs, worn the same 3 shirts on rotation until a client once asked gently if everything was okay at home. Everything had been fine. More than fine. That was a long time ago. Now Daniel Mercer was 44 years old, and on most mornings, he woke up before 5, made scrambled eggs for his 9-year-old son. Noah packed a lunch, drove him to school, and arrived at the office by 8:15 with a cup of coffee from the ground floor cafeteria, the same cafeteria that had been there since the building opened, back when the whole operation still smelled more like ambition than money. He liked it down there. It was the one place in the building where no one adjusted their posture when he walked in. This particular morning, he hadn't made the scrambled eggs. Noah had started running a fever just before 2 in the morning, the kind that climbs fast and frightens you, even when you know it's probably nothing. Daniel had spent the next 4 hours with a damp cloth and a thermometer sitting on the edge of his son's bed in the dark, watching the number on the digital display the way you watch a storm gauge. By 6, the fever had dropped enough that Noah had fallen back asleep, cheeks still flushed, breathing steady. Daniel had stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he'd called his neighbor. Margaret asked if she could watch Noah for the day, grabbed his keys off the counter, and driven straight to the office, changing nothing about what he was wearing. Gray sweatpants, old t-shirt, running shoes, with the left sole starting to separate. There was a 9 o'clock meeting. He could not move. A delegation from Chicago, 18 months in the making. He could shower later. Right now, he needed coffee. The ground floor cafeteria was busier than usual. Daniel noticed the Chicago group before he saw anything else. 8 people in tailored suits clustered near the far end of the room, paper cups in hand, being guided through what appeared to be an unofficial welcome tour. Their guide was a young woman he didn't recognize. Red blazer, dark hair pulled back a smile so practiced it had lost all its edges. He joined the line, picked up a cup, waited. He'd made it almost to the register when she noticed him. The young woman her name tag read. Brittany broke off mid-sentence. Her eyes moved over him the way eyes move over something that doesn't belong, quick, clinical, and then not bothering to hide what they found. "Excuse me." Her voice was pleasant, professionally pleasant. The kind of pleasant that lets you know immediately it's being performed for someone else. "Do you have your employee badge?" Daniel looked at her. "I work here." Brittany let out a small laugh. Not a nervous one, a delighted one, the kind you make when something confirms exactly what you already thought. She turned slightly toward the Chicago group, just enough to include them in the moment without being obvious about it. "Sir, I'm sure you do." The smile stayed perfectly in place. but we do have a security protocol, especially today. I'm going to have to ask you to—" "I work here," Daniel said again. His voice was even. Not cold, not heated. Just a fact offered a second time. Brittany's smile didn't waver. If anything, it sharpened. "Right." She said it the way people say sure when they mean absolutely not. Then she turned back to the Chicago delegation, 8 people who had gone very still and very attentive, and offered them a conspiratorial widening of her eyes. "I'm so sorry about this. We have a very strict visitor policy. It was the performance that was the thing." Not the challenge itself. Daniel had been challenged in rooms far larger, by people with far more leverage, but the theater of it. The way she'd angled her body toward the audience before she'd even finished her sentence. The way she wanted them to see her handling it. That was when Craig Henderson appeared. Craig was the head of human resources. 12 years at Pinnacle, a man who had survived 4 rounds of leadership transition by knowing with near animal precision which way the wind was blowing at any given moment. He was 51 years old and currently in the middle of a quiet, careful campaign to be named Chief Operating Officer, a vote the board would take at the end of the quarter, a vote that 2 of the Chicago delegates had indirect influence over. He took in the scene in under 3 seconds. A man in sweatpants at the register, a group of important visitors watching, Brittany holding the line. Craig made a small, decisive gesture toward the security guard stationed near the door. "Let's get this sorted outside," he said. Not to Daniel, just to the air between them in a tone that managed to be both professional and dismissive, without technically being either. The security guard stepped forward. Daniel did not argue, did not reach for his phone, did not raise his voice, did not say a word. He set his paper cup down on the counter with a quiet click and walked toward the glass doors. The security guard followed 2 paces behind a formality that was also an escort, which was also in the way these things are something worse than being asked to leave. The doors opened. The morning air came in. Daniel walked out of his own building. The steps outside Pinnacle's main entrance were broad and gray, the kind built to impress from a distance and be ignored up close. Daniel sat down on the second one from the top and looked out at the street. New York moved the way it always moved, indifferent, continuous, briefly loud, and then not. A cab accelerated through a yellow light. A woman walked past with headphones on, not looking up. 2 men in hard hats ate sandwiches on the curb across the street, talking about something that made them both laugh. He looked up at the building's facade. The letters were large enough to read from half a block away. Pinnacle Financial Group. He'd chosen that name himself in the shared office on the Lower East Side on a Tuesday night, when they'd had $17,000 in the bank and 4 clients who hadn't yet decided if they were staying. He'd thought it sounded like something that already existed, something established. He'd wanted people to feel before they ever walked through the door that the decision had already been made for them, 18 years. The first vitrines of the lobby had been installed when he was still driving a $2,000 Honda and eating dollar slices for dinner. He had watched the steel go up from the sidewalk, floor by floor, in the rain in February, with his hands shoved in his pockets. His phone buzzed. A text from Margaret Noah's asking if you'll be back in time to pick him up. Below it, a photo. Noah on Margaret's couch, a light blanket pulled to his waist, cheeks still carrying the last flush of the fever, but grinning, fully, completely with his whole face, the way kids grin when they feel better and want everyone to know about it. Daniel looked at the photo longer than he needed to. He was not by nature a man who held on to indignities. The building had been full of them in the early years, the investors who'd returned his calls a week late, or not at all. The clients who'd assumed from the address on his letterhead that he was a middleman for someone more serious. The way a room used to recalibrate when he walked in without a jacket back, when he couldn't afford the kind of jacket a room like that expected. He'd let all of it go. None of it had mattered in the end, but sitting on those steps, looking at his son's photo, something settled in him that wasn't anger and wasn't pride and wasn't hurt. It was something quieter than any of those things, and more durable. He thought about the cafeteria line, about the way Craig had gestured to the security guard without looking at him, the efficiency of it, the ease. He thought about how many people moved through that lobby every day. Maintenance workers, interns, junior analysts, the people who stocked the cafeteria and cleaned the marble floors and kept the brass fixtures bright. People who did not have a name on the building and no recourse when someone decided in under 3 seconds that they didn't belong. How many of them had been handled the same way, and how many of them had nowhere to go afterward except back inside. He pulled up his contacts, found Sophie's name, his assistant of 6 years, the person who knew his schedule better than he did and had never once pretended otherwise. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey, the 9 o'clock is already set up. They're just waiting for—" "Push the 9 o'clock to 3, Daniel said. "Full leadership. I want the Chicago delegation in the room too. Tell them I want them to understand how we operate before we talk about anything with a dollar figure attached." A beat of quiet on Sophie's end. He could hear her recalibrating. "And the dress code?" she asked carefully. "I'll be there as I am." He looked down at his sweatpants, his worn shoes, the fraying hem of his t-shirt. "Don't say anything else about it." He ended the call, stood up, looked at the building one more time at his name up there, in letters meant to be read from half a block away. Then he went to find a different coffee. Sophie called back in 4 minutes. "The board members are asking questions," she said. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone choosing words with great care. "They heard about this morning. James Whitfield specifically asked me, and I'm quoting him directly, whether you might want to, and I'm still quoting, 'Take an hour at home before coming in.'" Daniel was walking west on 42nd Street with a coffee from a cart on the corner. The cup was paper. The coffee was bitter, and it was exactly what he wanted. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd pass the message along." "Good. Tell him I said thank you, and I'll see him at 3. There was a moment on Sophie's end, not hesitation exactly, more like the sound of someone absorbing information they'd already predicted. She had worked for him for 6 years. She knew the difference between the times he needed to be talked down and the times he had already decided. "The Chicago group is still in the building," she said. "Brittany's doing the floor tour. They're on 3 right now." "That's fine. Craig Henderson has been on the phone with legal since about 10 minutes after you left." Daniel took a sip of the coffee. "I know. He also reached out to Whitfield and Patricia Haynes directly. I don't know what he said. I can guess." He stopped at a crosswalk, watched the light. "Sophie, 3 o'clock. Everyone in the room. Do you need anything else from me to make that happen?" "No." "Then I'll see you at 2:50. Craig Henderson sat in his office on the 31st floor and did what he did well. He managed. He'd called legal first, a brief, careful conversation in which he described the morning's events as a security protocol activation involving an unidentified individual, and asked, theoretically, about the company's exposure if the individual in question chose to characterize the interaction as harassment. Legal had been cautious, unsatisfying, and ultimately unhelpful in the way legal always was when you needed clarity, and they gave you contingency. Then he'd called Whitfield. James Whitfield was 63, a founding board member, and a man who believed with genuine conviction that the most important thing a company could do in any situation was not create a situation. Craig had known him long enough to understand that Whitfield's support was not personal, it was positional. He backed whoever kept the surface smooth. Craig kept his account of the morning factual and brief. He did not mention that he'd been the one to signal the security guard. He described Brittany's role in terms of overzealousness, a word he selected specifically because it implied something correctable without implying something systemic. He floated the idea of a quiet resolution, a conversation between HR and Daniel, an acknowledgement, perhaps a written protocol review. nothing that needed to reach a conference room. Whitfield listened. Then he said he appreciated Craig's proactivity and that he hoped Daniel would see reason before 3 o'clock. Craig thanked him, ended the call, and felt for the first time since he'd spotted Daniel at the register that morning that he was standing on solid ground again. He had years of institutional knowledge in this building. He knew where all the weight was distributed. Daniel came back through the main entrance at 2:47. He came in the way a person enters a place they own, not fast, not slow, not looking for permission from the architecture. The lobby security team, 2 men at the front desk who had worked that post for a combined total of 19 years, recognized him from 20 feet out. The taller one, Marcus, was already moving to hold the inner door before Daniel reached it. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say. Daniel nodded once and walked toward the elevators. The 3rd floor was visible from the mezzanine level, open plan, glass-sided. Brittany was mid-sentence when she saw him the same moment, the same angle almost identical to the morning, except that now there were 40 feet of open air between them instead of 10 feet of cafeteria tile. She was pointing toward the east wing. Her hand stayed up for a second after her voice stopped. He was already at the VIP elevator bank. Brittany said something quick and quiet to the Chicago group, an excuse, a redirect, and crossed the floor toward the mezzanine stairs. By the time she came around the corner, Daniel was standing in front of the elevator, with a key card held loosely at his side. "Sir." Her voice was different now. Not the practiced warmth from the morning, not the performance. Just a single word trying to do too many things at once. "Sir, that elevator requires..." Daniel pressed his card to the reader. The display above the door turned green. A soft chime. The doors opened. Brittany stopped. He turned and looked at her directly, calmly, the way a person looks at something they've already thought through. There was no satisfaction in it. No edge. "Come up to 47, he said. "I think it'll be useful for you." He stepped into the elevator. She followed. She didn't know what else to do. They almost didn't make it up. From the side corridor that connected the east stairwell to the elevator bank, Craig appeared not running, but moving at the maximum speed at which a man could move without appearing to run. He reached the elevator threshold just as Sophie, who had come down to meet Daniel, was stepping inside. The doors were still open. Craig planted himself at the gap. "Daniel." Craig's voice was measured, controlled. This was the voice he used in difficult meetings, the one that said, "I am calm, and therefore I am right." "I think before we do this, it's worth having a conversation. Just the 2 of us." Daniel looked at him. "There's $200 million on the table," Craig said, dropping his voice by half. "The Chicago partnership. Whitfield and Patricia both have equity relationships with that group, personal ones. If you walk into that room right now and turn this into a public disciplinary hearing, you're not just making a statement. You're sending a signal to every partner this company has, and you're doing it in front of the people it'll hurt most." He said it well. That was the thing about Craig, he always said things well. He'd built his entire career on it. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Not with anger. With something more considered than anger. "You've been in this building for 12 years, Daniel said. "And the first thing you said to me just now was about a dollar figure." Craig opened his mouth. Not an apology, not an explanation. A dollar figure. Daniel's voice stayed level, but something in it had changed, a weight that hadn't been there before, settling into each word. "That tells me exactly what you were protecting this morning, and it wasn't the company." Craig said nothing. For the first time all day, he had nothing positioned and ready. "If the Chicago group walks away because I took a serious thing seriously," Daniel said, "then they were never the right partners. I'd rather know that now." He stepped back into the elevator. The doors closed. The ride to 47 took less than a minute. Brittany stood against the back wall of the elevator car, with her hands pressed flat against her thighs. Sophie stood near the panel looking straight ahead. Daniel stood in the center, watching the floor numbers climb on the display above the doors. Brittany spoke first. She couldn't not speak. The silence was its own kind of pressure, and she had never been good at pressure without feeling it. Mr. Mercer, her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. I want you to know, I had no idea who you were. I was following protocol. I wasn't trying to, I would never intentionally. Daniel let her finish. Then he said, my son had a fever last night. 103 degrees just before 2 in the morning. His voice was quiet, not unkind. He was looking at the floor display. As he spoke, the numbers moving upward in orange light. I was with him until 6. When he finally fell back asleep, I drove straight here. I didn't have time to change. Brittany nodded quickly. I understand. And I'm so sorry. I didn't. That's why I looked the way I looked. He turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her, but no longer looking away. But I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it. She went still. If I had been exactly what you thought I was, if I had actually been a man with nowhere to go, who'd wandered in off the street to get out of the cold, do you think you would have handled it differently? The elevator continued upward. Brittany opened her mouth. She was a quick thinker. In most situations, she had an answer ready before the question had fully landed. But this one went somewhere the quick answers didn't reach. She felt it close off one by one. I was following protocol closed. I didn't know closed. It wasn't personal closed, because it had been personal. That was the thing she couldn't quite bury. The way she'd turned toward the Chicago group before she'd even finished her first sentence. The brightness in her voice. The way the laugh had come so naturally, so immediately, as if she'd been waiting for a reason. You don't need to answer me, Daniel said. That's not why I asked. The elevator slowed. The number 47 appeared in the display. You just need to answer yourself. The doors opened. The entire senior leadership team of Pinnacle Financial Group was standing in the hallway outside the main conference room, arranged in the loose, self-conscious cluster of people who have been waiting and don't want to look like they've been waiting. Whitfield was there. Patricia Haynes. 6 other faces Daniel knew by name and tenure and the specific texture of their ambitions. At the far end of the corridor, Sophie had already directed the Chicago delegation toward the conference room entrance. 8 people in tailored suits, who had by this point witnessed enough of the day's events to understand that whatever meeting they'd come to New York for was no longer the most interesting thing happening. Daniel walked out of the elevator and into the hallway without breaking stride. He did not look at Whitfield, did not acknowledge the cluster of faces watching him move. He walked into the conference room, pulled out the chair at the head of the table, and sat down in his sweatpants and his worn-out shoes and his fraying t-shirt, exactly as he was in front of every person in that building whose opinion was supposed to matter. Nobody sat down before he did. He poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher at the center of the table. That was the first thing he did. Not an opening statement, not an acknowledgement of the room. He poured the water, set the pitcher back down, and took a drink. Around the table, 22 people watched him do it, and understood in the particular way that people understand things they cannot articulate, that the meeting had already begun. Among them, seated along the right side of the table, was the Chicago delegation, 8 people in tailored suits, Robert Kane at the near end. Kane was 61 years old, lead partner on the Chicago side of the proposed agreement, and a man who had spent 30 years developing a highly calibrated instinct for the difference between companies that were worth knowing and companies that were worth trusting. He had said very little since entering the room. He was watching Daniel the way you watch a person when you're trying to understand how they're constructed. Near the door, in one of the chairs set against the wall, the kind reserved for people summoned to a meeting rather than seated at it, Brittany sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. No one had directed her to that chair specifically. She had simply understood walking into the room that the distance between herself and the main table was not accidental. This morning, Daniel said, I was escorted out of this building by a security guard. He said it the way a person states a weather condition. No performance in it. No invitation for reaction. Just the fact placed on the table. I'm going to show you what that looked like. Sophie, standing near the credenza at the side of the room, opened her laptop. The wall screen behind Daniel's chair came to life. The footage was from the cafeteria camera, fixed angle, slightly elevated timestamp in the lower right corner, reading 7:41 in the morning. The image quality was sharp enough that nothing required interpretation. The room watched. The Chicago delegation watched. They had the careful expressions of people who were witnessing something that was not on the agenda and have decided wisely to be very quiet. The footage ran for 3 minutes and 14 seconds. When it ended, Sophie closed the laptop. Nobody spoke. Daniel let the silence be what it was. He didn't reach to fill it, didn't use it as punctuation for effect. He simply sat with it the way a room sits with something true. "I'm not here because I was embarrassed," he said finally. "I want to be precise about that, because the reason matters." He looked down the length of the table, taking in each face at the speed of someone who has already thought about every person in the room. "What you just watched is not a story about me. I own this building. I'll be fine. The story is about what that footage tells us about how this place operates when I'm not watching." Whitfield at the far end of the table shifted in his chair. He was too experienced to show discomfort openly, but it was there in the angle of his shoulders, the way his hand moved to the edge of the table and back. "How many people pass through that lobby every day?" Daniel asked. "Maintenance staff, the woman who restocks the cafeteria every morning at 6, the junior analysts on the 15th floor who've been here 8 months and still aren't sure if they're allowed to take the main elevator." He let the question settle. How many of them have had a version of this morning? And where do they go afterward? Who do they tell? No one answered. It wasn't that kind of question. I built this company for 18 years, and I never built them anywhere to go. That's not Brittany's failure. That's mine. And it's the failure of everyone in this room who has had the authority to change it and didn't. Whitfield said carefully, "Daniel, I think we all agree that what happened this morning was—" "I'm not finished, James." Whitfield closed his mouth. Daniel turned to look at Brittany. She had the look of someone who has been bracing for impact long enough that they've stopped being afraid of it and have arrived somewhere past fear into a strange, exhausted calm. "You've been here 3 months, Daniel said. I don't think you came to work the first day planning to be the person you were in that footage. I think you learned what was rewarded and what was overlooked, and you acted accordingly." He kept his voice even. Not gentle, not harsh, precise. "But what you showed this morning isn't something I can put back into a role that represents this company's front door. I hope you understand the difference." Brittany gave a small, single nod. There was no argument in her. Whatever she'd expected walking into this room by now, she understood that the version where she walked out still employed was not available. Craig Henderson was seated at the main table 4 chairs down from Whitfield. He had maintained throughout Daniel's remarks the bearing of a man who believes his position is defensible, shoulders back expression, attentive but not alarmed, the posture of someone waiting for the moment when the conversation returned to terrain he knew. When Daniel looked at him, Craig spoke first. "I want to say for the record that my actions this morning were made in good faith. We had VIP guests in the building. There was an individual who couldn't produce identification. The decision I made was consistent with our security guidelines, and I stand behind the intent behind it, which was to protect the company's interests." He said it well. He had always said things well. Daniel looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "You understand better than most people in this room the difference between a policy and a judgment call," Daniel said. "What you made this morning was a judgment call." He kept his eyes on Craig's face. "And I think you know the calculation you were running when you made it." Craig's expression didn't change, but something behind it, did something small and involuntary, a flicker of recognition that he couldn't fully suppress. You weren't protecting the company, Daniel said. You were protecting your candidacy. Those are not the same thing. And the fact that you knew better and still chose that, that's not a mistake I can work with. A mistake is not knowing better. You knew better. Craig opened his mouth. Then for the first time that day, he closed it again without speaking. I'm going to ask you both to gather your personal items before end of day, Daniel said. He looked between Craig and Brittany briefly, then moved on. Sophie will coordinate the administrative details. He turned back to the main table. 3 things are going to change effective immediately, he said. First, we're building a conduct training program. Not a 1-hour HR module, an actual program mandatory for everyone from the front desk to the deputy director level, built around the question of what we value and how we treat people at every level of this organization. Second, we're creating an internal reporting line, anonymous, for people at any level to flag how they're being treated. It should have existed 10 years ago. Third, the internal dress code policy is gone. We evaluate people on their work. That's it. He looked around the room one more time. Whitfield's face had passed through several phases and had arrived at something that resembled, if not agreement, then at least the absence of resistance. Patricia Haynes had been making notes on the pad in front of her for the last several minutes, which in Daniel's experience meant she was thinking rather than performing. That's what I needed to say, Daniel said. He reached for his water glass. Now I'd like to talk about what we're going to do with the rest of the afternoon. Robert Kane had said very little since entering the conference room, but he had watched everything. In 30 years of financial services, he had developed the discipline of staying quiet in rooms where other people were performing and waiting for the moment when someone stopped. This had been such a room, at least in the beginning. It was not that room anymore. He leaned over and said something quiet to the colleague on his left. The colleague nodded once and sat back. Then Kane looked down the table. Mr. Mercer. His voice carried without effort. Before we get to the agenda, I want to say something if you'll allow it. Daniel looked at him. Go ahead. I've sat across the table from a lot of organizations in 30 years. I've learned to pay attention to moments they don't know I'm watching. Kane's hands were flat on the table, relaxed. In all that time, I have never seen a CEO sit in front of his own board and his prospective partners and say out loud, "This is where I failed." Not in a press release, not in a restructuring memo. In the room, while it was still happening. The conference room was quiet. We came to New York to evaluate whether this is a company we want to build something with, Kane said. I think we got a more complete answer to that question than we expected. He held Daniel's gaze. We're signing. Daniel nodded, not with relief, not with triumph. Simply the nod of a man who had said what he had to say and was prepared for whatever followed. Then let's talk about the agreement, he said. He left the building at 5:05. The evening had cooled, and the street outside Pinnacle's entrance had the particular quality of a Tuesday. In early fall, unhurried, the light going amber and long, the city making its gradual adjustment from the pace of the day to whatever came next. Daniel walked 2 blocks to where he'd parked that morning, unlocked the car, and drove uptown through traffic that moved in the slow, resigned way of traffic that has accepted its own nature. Margaret's building was 11 minutes away. He made it in 9. Noah was outside on the front steps when Daniel turned onto the block, sitting with his knees pulled up, backpack beside him, wearing the same pajama shirt he'd had on when Daniel left that morning, because Margaret had very sensibly determined that a child with a recent fever had no business changing into regular clothes. He spotted the car half a block out and was on his feet before it reached the curb. Daniel was still putting the car in park when the passenger door opened. You're early. Noah climbed in, dropping his backpack on the floor with a thud that suggested full recovery. He looked at his father with the unfiltered assessment of a 9-year-old. Dad, you're still in your pajamas. They're not pajamas. Your pajama pants. They're sweatpants. You wore sweatpants to work. Noah considered this with visible satisfaction, as though it confirmed a theory he'd been developing for some time. Did people think it was weird? Daniel pulled away from the curb. Some of them. Did you care? Daniel thought about the conference room, about the moment he'd sat down in the chair at the head of the table in the sweatpants and the fraying t-shirt, and watched 22 people take their seats around him, without a single one of them suggesting he was in the wrong place. Not really, he said. Noah appeared to find this acceptable. He reached into his backpack and produced a small, slightly crumpled drawing he'd made at Margaret's, a house, a car, a figure with yellow hair that Daniel assumed was meant to be him, although the proportions were ambitious. I made you something while I was sick. Margaret said I should give it to you when I felt better. He held it out. I feel better. Daniel took it at the next red light, held it up for a moment. The yellow-haired figure was very tall, taller than the house. Thank you, he said. You're welcome. Noah resettled into his seat, tucking one foot under himself. Can we get pizza tonight? I've been sick, so I think I deserve pizza. Daniel set the drawing on the dashboard where he could see it. The light changed. That's a reasonable argument, he said. I know. Noah looked out the window at the city going by, content, in the uncomplicated way of someone who has been unwell and is now not unwell, and considers this sufficient cause for satisfaction. I want the one with the garlic knots. That's the same place. I know. I want both. Daniel drove. The evening light came in through the windshield at a low angle, catching the dust on the dashboard, the edges of the drawing, the fine hair at his son's temple. The city moved around them unhurried, now amber and long, and for the first time in a day that had started at 2 a.m, with a thermometer and a damp cloth, and a number that kept climbing. Daniel felt the particular quality of stillness that isn't stillness at all, but just the world moving at a speed you can finally keep up with. Garlic knots, he said. Okay. Noah smiled at the window. I knew you'd say yes. A man who stayed up all night for his son walked into the building he built, looking like he had nothing, and still turned out to be everything. Not because of the name on the door, because of who he was when no one knew it.